Alrighty, let's get started. So just before I begin, I do sound like RFK crossed with the nanny at the moment. I don't know why that is, but play there with my voice. And I'd also like to begin with an acknowledgement of the country that we're on, the land of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and also emerging ones as well. So today I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Genevieve Quek from the Marks Institute at the University of Western Sydney. Jen did her PhD, combined PhD and Neuropsych Masters at Macquarie University before jetting straight off to Europe for quite a number of years, working at the Université Catholique de Louvain, the other UCL as we call it, with really prominent face researcher Bruno Rossillon. She basically ran his lab while she was there, crash course in managing quite a lot of people, including me. From there, she got a Marie Curie Skłodowska fellowship and worked at the Doctors Institute for quite a while, looking at sort of spatial relationships in vision. And I'm not sure if some of that's going to pop up in the talk, but it's really fascinating work. And then she finally got a bit too bored of Dutch food and decided to come back to Australia. And since then, she's been working at the University of Western Sydney, growing her lab across multiple fronts and doing a whole bunch of really exciting research that you will hear about today. So yeah, this is Jen, take it away.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the invite to be here. It's fun. Lovely to come and visit with you all. It's fun for me just to be on a campus because Western Sydney Uni is split into many, many different campuses, and the one that I'm on is a research institute. So we have a lovely, nice new building. Come and visit with us, but we don't have any students and we don't have any like campus buzz. So I enjoyed my little walk along the way here, chatting with people and just being like, oh, people are learning. It's nice. So I, as Dan alluded to, have done some work in face recognition and some work in object recognition. I'm broadly interested in those two things in the temporal unfolding of high-level vision, if you like. What I'm going to talk about today is really in the face recognition space. Comes out of some work that we've been doing in the last couple of years, together with other Cog Neuro people at Marks, but also collaborators at UNSW. This is in the space of individual differences in face recognition. And as we go along, I'll tell you a little bit more about whether we're interested in the bottom or the top end in terms of differences. I want to start off by kind of setting up a little bit the framework for what we want to think about in this talk, which is the idea that when you recognize people out and about in the wild, it's very often spontaneous, right? It's unplanned. You come around the corner and you see at the bus stop, oh, there's the barista who was making my coffee this morning. I realize now this is actually a photograph of UQ, which is not particularly strategic in this context, but the example is there, right? You walk around the corner, you recognize someone, you weren't looking for them, but you did recognize them anyway. Of course, though, when we do it in the lab, face recognition is almost never spontaneous, right? So most of the established metrics that we have and established ways we have of measuring the degree to which you recognize someone are contingent on tasking people with trying to remember that face and then subsequently recognizing them later. So here are some classic examples that you might be familiar with. In both cases, you've got an exposure phase where you're trying to learn these faces. Subsequent to that, of course, there's going to be a test. This one's working. There we go. So these established face recognition measures that have this deliberate or effortful form of face recognition, they are very good at reliably identifying individual differences in this capacity. So these tests allow us to establish whether someone might be down the low end of the face recognition ability spectrum, someone with prosopagnosia down here. Immediately above that, just above the clinical threshold is me. I'm actually a very bad face recognizer. So if I've ever blanked you at a conference or not known who you were until you started speaking, that's why. But of course, at the top end of the spectrum is where some of the other interesting stuff happens. This is where super recognizers sit. These are individuals who readily recognize people, even though they may have only encountered them briefly, even though it may have been a very long time ago since their last exposure. Now, it's a small group of people, estimated to be within 1 or 2% of the population, depending on how you define what a super recognizer is. What we know about them is that they really excel at these face memory tasks, the kind that you've already seen before. They also do really well, though, on face matching. So this is where the memory element is removed and you're given multiple images of faces side by side and you need to make some kind of comparative judgment. You can think of sort of practical instances where this would be relevant. So in a kind of CCTV situation where you need to identify which of these 4 truly identical looking men that guy could be. Apparently it is that one. If you think you may have spotted that, come and find me later and I make you do my test. But also super recognizers are really robust to changes that we might think of as even more expansive and not just related to image degradation. I'm not really sure which way to point this to get it to work. I may give up on it. Right, so this one, if you have done this one before, don't spoil it for people who don't know it. This is what's called the Before They Were Famous test. Maybe you have an idea of who these people are. As I put this together, I thought to myself, this test kind of needs an update because I don't think anyone, a certain portion of the population now, perhaps the kind attending university, probably don't know who either of these people are. It's Brad Pitt and Princess Diana, in case you wanted to check your answers there. Right, so this is what super recognizers can do in the lab. We know they're really good at both of these kinds of tests. And there's increasing interest, I think, in tapping into those abilities that super recognizers demonstrate, because you can think of multiple applications in security and forensic settings, policing, where having the ability to accurately identify someone by their face would be really relevant. And so there's lots of proliferating academic work on that, particularly in Europe, where there's established efforts going on with the Berlin police force and also in London, but also lots of media coverage around it, some from more salubrious sources than others. So people are definitely thinking about this, and we are also thinking about this alongside, as we said, our collaborators at UNSW. We're working now with David White, who actually maintains a database of super recognizers around the world. It's his test that you can do to find out if you are one. And we were lucky to get funded to do some, to expand his research program a little while ago, and I'm going to talk you through some of that work today. What we're interested in here is how super recognizers are performing on what I alluded to right at the beginning, which is that spontaneous form of face recognition. And it's interesting to think about because that is actually the experience that characterizes what it's like to be one of these people, right? It's walking through the world and spotting people all over the place that you've encountered before, even only briefly. And so we are interested in finding ways to tap that sort of implicit recognition or tap into identity sensitivity in a more implicit way. And I think that's important to do here because what the deliberate and effortful tests related to face recognition inadvertently conflate, of course, is motivation with ability. And if we really want to understand more about ability that this top end of performers have and try to understand something about what it is that makes them really good at face perception, we do really need to be able to pull motivation out of it and consider it separately to ability. And of course, because we're cognitive neuroscientists, we're also super interested in the neural basis of super recognition, or indeed just heightened face recognition abilities in general. That's a topic that has really been explored in just a handful of papers. There's a group in Switzerland led by Maike Ramon, who's working on this. She also does EEG. And she has got some really nice data showing already that there is a neural differentiation between super recognizers and more typical recognizer counterparts. We're building on that work with some of the stuff that we're doing, trying to look at actually the representational format of identity encoding in these brains. So this is kind of the broad goal for where this research program is aimed at. I'm going to talk you through today 3 experiments. 2 behaviour and then 1 EEG at the end. So in the first experiment, we're going to try to build up the evidence for spontaneous face recognition having an advantage in super recognizers. To do this, we're going to try and come up with a paradigm that taps into sensitivity to identity in an implicit way, so without overtly tasking observers with attending to identity, responding to identity, etc. In the second experiment, we try to test the possibility that processing of identity in super recognizers is actually mandatorily activated. And this is the idea that what they might be doing is inadvertently prioritizing identity information, possibly even when it's not task relevant. So we'll pit 2 different dimensions of faces against each other there and see whether identity can actually interfere with perception of the other face dimension. And then in the third experiment, I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk you through some neural decoding results that one of our PhD students has been hard at work on for the last several years. She's interested here in understanding whether identity representations themselves at the neural level are more robust in super recognizers than they are in typical controls, which is what might, I suppose, represent a kind of neural correlate of their behavioural advantage that they exhibit. I'm going to show you some data that speak to that, and we're also going to explore whether the format, the representational format of that identity code is more consistent within super recognizers than it is within typical controls. So that's what we're going to step through today. But I'm going to start off talking by talking about this initial behavioural experiment, which is where this research program kind of got started for us. So as we said here, the goal here is to develop an implicit test of sensitivity to identity. If we're not going to ask people directly to tell us which faces go together or remember this face and do you remember it later, we need to find a way of kind of covertly tapping into whether they recognize someone that they're looking at. Ironically, maybe you recognize this face. This is your own Tim Cottier, who's working with us now on this. This is work that Tim has been doing since he joined our group, and he's, of course, led all the analyses that you're going to see here. So the approach that we're using here is lifted a bit from the scene and object perception literature. Maybe you know this triplet odd one out task that people like Martin Habart have done a lot of work with. So in this design, classically, you give people a random selection of objects and you get them to repeatedly over many trials, select which object doesn't belong or which one is the odd one out. And over time and over trials, this lets you build up a representational framework that kind of captures the global similarities between objects and then, of course, their differences as well. Here, we tweak it a little bit. So what we're asking people to do here is look at these three faces and select which face they think is the most visually distinct. So this is a deliberately vague instruction. We don't want them to attend specifically to a particular aspect of the face. You're free to make your own decision about what you think visually distinct should represent to you. So it's a free choice paradigm. There's no right answer to this. There's no wrong answer. And we don't give you any kind of feedback. You just make your selection. So in this particular example, you could click on this guy. I think he has a very distinctive frontal view, right? The other two are three-quarter profiles. He's looking right at the camera. This would be a good enough reason to say that is the visually distinct face. Equally though, you could have selected this face. This guy is distinct in terms of valence. The other two faces are smiling. This guy is not smiling. That might stand out to you and you might want to select based on that aspect. Alternatively, you could have selected this guy. I'm reliably informed that that is a different man to those two. They might have all been different men to me. Maybe it stands out to you. Again, congratulations. If so, what a great way to move through the world that must be. So the point is here that we have constructed these triplets in a way that participants are unaware of course, constructed them so that two of the faces are sharing an identity, a different pair share the same valence, and a different pair share a similar viewpoint. And of course, what this is designed to do is to render each face as an outlier along a single dimension. And what that means then is your selection should tell us which of those dimensions, those identity, valence, and viewpoint, you found to be most salient on that trial. And so that's the categorical outcome of that we're going to look at here. It's just which dimension did you endorse on every trial. So we can go directly now to who we tested with this. So as I said, this is work done in partnership with UNSW via David White's face registry database. So we recruited two different groups of individuals from this existing database. One group are what I'm calling confirmed super recognizers. So everyone in this database has done at least 3 of these standardized face recognition tests. They've done the Cambridge face memory test, which is the super classic one. They've done the Glasgow face matching task, and they've done the UNSW face test, which has both a memory and a matching component. To qualify as a super recognizer for our study, you have to have performed very well on each of those 3 tests individually. So above 1.7 standard deviations above the mean on those 3. There is a reasonable debate going on about what's the right kind of way to define a super recognizer. I'm not super interested in that for our purposes here. Suffice to say that these people have heightened face recognition abilities compared to our control group, who are all right around the mean in terms of those same tests. So these are our 2 groups that come directly from the registry, and then we also have a less controlled control group, if you like. These are people coming from Prolific, which is an online recruitment platform, just a recruitment platform, and we're going to compare scores across these three. It's quite typical in this kind of research to have both something closer to like a matched control group in the typical recognizers, and then a more free control group to see how some of those motivational aspects influence results as well. All right, so here are our three groups of participants, and we'll go directly now to looking at the results in this task. So on the y-axis, we're just going to see the proportion of trials on which you endorsed each of these three dimensions along the x-axis. And of course, we'll look at those as a function of our three different participant groups. So here, of course, if you're selecting randomly and not doing the task in any meaningful way, you should be at chance for selecting either of these three dimensions. Chance here is, of course, 33%. And if we start off by looking at the control data, you can see that both control groups, so both the registry control and the less controlled Prolific controls, do prefer to endorse identity over either valence or viewpoint. It's important to note that these are proportional scores, right? So obviously as tendency to endorse identity goes up, the other two have to come down. So we can consider both things like difference from zero here, as well as overall proportional rates. So here are our two control groups, both preferring identity. What happens for super recognizers? Well, as predicted, or as we hoped, what we found is that tendency to prioritize identity information in the set of three faces is enhanced for super recognizers relative to both those control groups, actually. And this was nice for us to see, because this is, as far as I know, the first instance of demonstrating this super recognizer advantage on a test that isn't directly asking people to really attend to identity. So, of course, there's the possibility that maybe that's what they're tasking themselves with anyway, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But at least initially, we'd like to interpret this as evidence for an implicit measure of sensitivity to identity also being an effective way to reveal a super recognizer advantage. I will say as well that this is one of the rarer instances of just looking at face memory, just looking at face matching rather. So we've deliberately kept memory out of it for now. In fact, all of the tasks that I'll show you don't really go to memory here at all. We have a separate arm of research that's starting to look a little bit more about memory for faces. And if you want to chat a bit more about that afterwards, we certainly can. All right, so this was the first experiment. What we can do with these data as well, though, is examine how our implicit index of identity sensitivity correlates with these pre-existing scores on these standardized face perception measures. So that's our proportion of identity endorsed trials along the x-axis here. This is the Cambridge Face Memory Test Z-score on the left column, the UNSW face test in the middle, and then on the right, I think, is a composite score. It probably doesn't really need to be there, it's a bit distracting. I think you can see, though, they're strongly correlated, right? So that's compelling for us to see, because it assures us to some extent that the implicit measure that we are developing here is trying to, or is at least associated with tapping into the same underlying construct as the explicit tests measure. It's good to see that they do correlate such that the better you are at performing on these explicit measures, the more likely you are to endorse identity as the salient dimension on any one of these trials. All right, so far then, it's a shame that that thing is covering up part of that. I don't know how to get rid of it though, so I'll just read you what it says. So far then, our results from experiment 1 do seem to suggest that the super recognizer advantage isn't contingent on this explicit attention to faces. So you don't have to task people overtly with attending to identity to be able to see the benefit that this group of individuals enjoy. And as I said before, one interpretation of these results then is that identity processing is actually mandatory in this group of individuals, such that it's really just jumping out at them, irrespective of how they might otherwise go about doing the task, even when they're not explicitly trying to recognize people. The alternative explanation, though, and it's a serious possibility here, is that our super recognizers, because they know they're good at face recognition, have just kind of covertly tasked themselves with doing an identity matching task. And both of those possibilities could actually explain or account for the pattern of results that I've shown here. If it is a case of super recognizers mandatorily processing identity, though, it should be possible to contrive a set of circumstances where that is of negative consequence to you. And by that, I mean, if we make identity task irrelevant and actually potentially detrimental to your task performance, we can actually produce a circumstance where an increased sensitivity to identity might actually impair your performance. And that's what we do in our second experiment, where we pit expression against identity. So then, this is another online study, also run by Tim, in which he's adopted a Garner-style interference paradigm. So in these Garner tasks, typically there is one task-relevant dimension that you're meant to be attending to, and the other task-irrelevant dimension is varied orthogonally with respect to the first. What that means for us here is that we ask people to judge face expression, and we tell them to ignore the identity of the face. So I have a little demo what this looks like. It's truly horrible. You may see for yourself. So here, each trial contains two faces. Each of the faces appears for just 200 milliseconds, and obviously we've included these visual masks as well. Your task is to decide if the two faces in the trial have the same expression or different expressions. And we've made that particularly irritating here because we've used two negative expressions. These are expressions that are labeled in the database that they come from as angry and sad. They're both negative emotions, harder to separate than something like angry and happy, obviously. So it is quite a difficult task that we get people to do, and as you may or may not be able to tell, whether or not the identity of the face in phase 1 and phase 2 is the same or different is varying trial to trial. So we got 33 super recognizers to do this task online, 40 typical recognizers from that same registry, and then also a batch of prolific controls. And the task itself breaks down like this. So half of the trials have the same expression, or they're expression match trials, you should say same. Half of the trials obviously mismatch in terms of expression, identity varying orthogonally, such that 50% of the trials, the two images are coming from the same person, 50% they're two different people. What I do want to point out here is that there's always a big visual change from phase 1 to phase 2, and that's because we make sure that viewpoint is changing, right? So the first face is always frontal, the second face is always this 3/4 side view, and what that means is that, or what we hope it means, is that you can't do this expression-related task by just attending to sort of local featural changes that would presumably be stronger for instances of the same identity face than for two different identities. So we force this big visual change by having the face viewpoint always shift on every trial, and we hope that makes it slightly less driven by local features. All right, so as we said, you're attending to expression, you're ignoring identity. The thought here, of course, is that if super recognizers are have an increased sensitivity to identity information, they should actually experience a greater interference effect in this kind of paradigm. So the classic way to think about that identity interference effect is in terms of slowing you down. So what I'm going to show you here is an interference effect for RT, which is the different identity trials minus the same identity trials. And we'll focus initially here on the left side of the plot. These are expression match trials. The colors here are not great. Slightly better here, but not by much. The means you can see, so that's important. Right, so on the left-hand side of the plot here, we've got expression match trials. You should be saying same. And what you can see is that all participant groups have an identity interference effect. So all of our groups here, and it's the same color mapping as before, super recognizers in orange, all of the groups are above 0 for their identity interference effect. And that just means that it is harder to say that two expressions are the same when they are on different people. It is a hard task, you just saw for yourselves in the demo. What we find in our data that's interesting, though, is that that identity interference effect is the largest for the super recognizers. That's the orange group here. So identity seems to modulate how long it takes you to say, yes, those two people have the same expression to a greater extent if you're a super recognizer than if you're a control. So this is compelling, I think, because we can be pretty sure that in this task, super recognizers are not covertly tasking themselves with identity, right? That would be a non-advantageous way to do this task. And what we know so far about this group is that they are a very motivated group of individuals. We give them a free text box at the end of the experiment to tell us their thoughts and reflections on the experiment, and these are long responses. These people are really trying to help us do better research, which is great, and we appreciate it. So we're pretty sure that they are trying hard to do the task, and that to adopt an identity-focused strategy here would not be very strategic for you. It would not help you do it. So we're pretty sure they're not attending to identity deliberately here, and yet we still have evidence that there's an increased sensitivity to the identity information carried in those faces. And on the face of it, that might feel or seem as though this is evidence for the idea that you can't inhibit identity processing if you're a super recognizer, and therefore, even if it doesn't serve your current task demands, it's getting in the way of things. But that isn't actually the whole story for these data, because even though they have this enhanced interference effect, they are actually still globally outperforming controls on the expression matching task itself. So here I'm showing you a different metric. This is D prime. So this is sensitivity for detecting instances of expression matches. And so obviously the higher the sensitivity, the better you are on this task. And what you can see is that super recognizers have higher sensitivity globally, regardless of whether it's two of the same face or two different individuals in back-to-back face presentations. They are better at this expression matching task. So it's not the case that this enhanced sensitivity to identity is coming at the cost of encoding other face dimensions. If it were, we might have expected to actually see globally depressed performance for super recognizers. I thought that's what we would find. That is not what we have. This is a fairly novel effect as far as I can tell. There's not very much work out there on aspects that aren't identity processing for super recognizers. The studies that have looked at expression usually actually look at labeling. So things like saying whether the label angry matches the face that's there or not. Obviously here we tap it somewhat differently by asking people to make judgments about the degree to which expressions correspond. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we do find a robust expression advantage here for super recognizers where other people haven't so far. Right, so they are more sensitive to this expression information. At the same time, that sensitivity is also affected by task-irrelevant identity to a greater extent if you're a super recognizer than if you're a control. And by that, I mean, on the right-hand side here, again, terrible colors, I'm just subtracting same and different from one another to produce an index of the degree to which identity is interfering with your sensitivity to expression. And you can see super recognizers floating way up the top here, much higher than either of our control groups.
Sorry, I'm going to ask a question.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah. Sorry,
you're reporting D prime here. Are there any criterion differences between
No, and I won't jump out to find the slide, but we have that data, and no, we also suspected that could be the case. No, criterion is constant across the groups, which is good to know for this analysis. Right, a bit of correlations for you. So here showing that expression matching ability, that's D prime, correlating with observers in previously collected face scores. That's an established effect in the literature. If you tend to be good at one, you're good at the other. What we can also do though is examine just within our own data in the subset of people who did experiment 1 and experiment 2, coming from both groups, whether or not our implicit index of identity sensitivity is correlated with expression matching. And we find that it is, at least in the case of the different identity trials, which I think is quite interesting. All right, so zipping forward then. I think experiment 2 is further evidence for this spontaneous processing of identity information in super recognizers compared to controls. We can base that on the fact that we found that identity interferes with their responses more when they're focused on expression matching. That's good to know. It's happening even though identity is task irrelevant. So we've kind of got at that motivational angle a little bit. At the same time, we uncover this global advantage for expression matching in this group of high-performing individuals, which, as I've said, is a reasonably novel effect in this literature. And we find that that expression matching ability is correlated with identity recognition as well, both the implicit and the explicit metrics that trace it. I'm reasonably on time. I've got just one more experiment. We're going to change gears though now and go to some neural data. So the unifying aspect that I mentioned before is that we're after implicit indices of identity perception in these individuals. So one way to do that, of course, are these slightly more complicated behavioural approaches that we've already gone through. Another way to do it, of course, is to put them in the EEG lab and record what happens when they look at faces and look for neural evidence of identity information. And that's what our PhD student Martina Ventura has been focused on for the past couple of years. The approach I'm using here is neural decoding. I am not going to give you a mechanistic explanation of how neural decoding works. There are experts in the room on that topic. What I'll say very briefly is that it involves training a linear classifier to associate a neural pattern of data with a particular label, and then testing it on a novel, unlabeled data set and seeing the degree to which it can predict the label that should correspond to that data. And the extent it's able to do that then provides an index or a metric of the degree to which the neural signals are carrying information along that dimension. Here, of course, I'm going to focus on identity, but you can imagine a range of dimensions that are associated with faces that could be decoded from these kind of data. And indeed, we are working on that as well. All right, so the nice thing about doing this with EEG, of course, as opposed to something like fMRI, is that it might also be able to tell us something about the stage of processing at which super recognizers are encoding identity differently to typical controls. And that's interesting to consider because, of course, you might imagine that it's a purely visual phenomenon. It's a kind of better or more veridical encoding of visual information. This is something that has been suggested by other people in the past. We're going to try and trace some evidence of that here. All right, so this is Martina. As I mentioned before, she's the one who's done all of this work. That work started by having her collect this enormous set of face images. Martina is Italian, and I think she has collected most of the Italian celebrities for this, who should be all unfamiliar to our Australian participants. So what she has here are 10 images of 40 different individuals. That stimulus set is stratified by sex, ethnicity, and age. Here I'm showing you female faces, but of course we have male faces as well. So you can see there's lots of variability in terms of, yes, how old you are, what ethnicity you are, and what sex you are, but also in terms of the pose of the face, the lighting conditions, the background, the specific expression, the hair, the style, etc., etc. So the goal of having all of this variability, of course, is we're trying to get at identity representations that are not about the specific image themselves, but something more general about the encoding of the face information. So Martina showed these images to super recognizers and typical recognizers. I think she has 23 super recognizers, which is a large sample of these people to have in an EEG lab. I think it's the largest one out there to date. And she shows the images to them in a very rapid sequence style. So they're on for 200 milliseconds each. There's no ISI, they're all back to back. And the task here is to detect instances of orthogonal faces. So the task looks something like this. These are faces are going by very quickly at this 5 Hertz rate. Occasionally you see one upside down and you need to press the button. The goal of that task, of course, is to have people attend to the structure of the faces, but without giving them something active to do related to identity. Thus, any identity signals we're able to decode from neural responses evoked by these images are relatively task-free, I would say, or certainly not identity task related. Right. So she does some pre-processing. We can fight about that later if you are motivated. And then she does representational similarity analysis. Again, I'm not going to get into the really gritty details of this. Suffice to say that what she's doing is pairwise decoding of individual identities. So for each of the 40 identities, she evaluates how similar neural responses evoked by the 10 images of that person are to 10 images of another person, person B, C, D, etc. And what that provides us then, when decoding accuracies are above chance, is evidence that the neural response is distinguishing between person A and person B, or person A and person C. This gets repeated across all pairwise combinations of identities in the experiment. And that produces for us a 40 by 40 representational dissimilarity matrix, or an RDM. And you can think of this as a matrix that's capturing the structure of identity representations, so how similar or different the neural patterns are for individual people at that specific time point, because of course this analysis is getting repeated over at each individual time point, stepping through all the way to 800 milliseconds. All right, so for our purposes here, I want you to just latch onto the idea that the greater the dissimilarity between neural patterns evoked by faces, the more separable those identity representations are in the neural signal. That's the way we're interpreting it for now. It's worth noting as well, though, they're not just separable from each other, but they also have to be similar to themselves, because there's 10 images of every person, 10 different images. All right, so let's have a look at some of these data. We're going to see how decodable these 40 individual identities are from one another as a function of time. Practically speaking, this is just the average of the lower triangle in the RDM. On the x-axis, you've got time running out to 800 milliseconds, time from stimulus onset. On the y-axis is going to be decoding accuracy. We're looking for above chance value, so above 50%. And we're going to plot our super recognizers and typical recognizers separately. Decoding is always run at the level of the individual subject, and then we're just averaging within our two separate groups. So what we find is that the neural responses in both groups actually contain reliable information about face identity. It's arising just before 100 milliseconds. It's lasting until at least 500 milliseconds. And this, below the plot, you can see Bayes factors that are quantifying the evidence for those decoding signals being above chance. And this is, at least in my mind, no small feat because, as you saw, those images are going by super quickly. You don't see it depicted here, but there is actually a new image every 200 milliseconds that's appearing in the sequence. So the identity signals that we're tapping into here are, I would say, certainly robust signals about identity. And it's compelling to see that it doesn't matter what kind of brain you have, those are evoked. Admittedly, my own data is not there. I was not a participant in this task. Right, okay, so evidence of identity representation in both groups, which is nice. Critically though, although both groups are encoding identity information, we also have evidence to suggest that that identity code is stronger, or there's better separation of the identities themselves in super recognizers compared to controls at a specific time point. And that's focused here at around 350 milliseconds. The Bayes factor plot below is testing the difference between the two profiles. So we're really excited by that because I think this is maybe an initial possible neural correlate for the behavioural advantage that exists for this group of individuals. And we're working now on how we can link these, the decodability of faces in the neural signal to the behavioural performance that individuals exhibit. There's no behavioural element of this task, of course, but we have pre-existing scores for these people. Interestingly as well, and I alluded to this before, it's not an early visual differentiation, right? So it isn't that the initial 100 milliseconds of vision is just encoded more strongly for super recognizers. That would lead to presumably an enhanced peak down in this stage. This difference between super recognizers and controls is arising at this post-perceptual stage. And if you'll indulge me in just one more little analysis, I wanted to show you that we can also do some work here that goes to the consistency of that neural code. So you'll recall that every subject has this 40 by 40 RDM. We can do a kind of second order RSA where we just correlate RDMs across participants. And this tells us something about whether the structure of those identity representations, the representational format, if you like, whether that's similar across individuals in our participant sample. So here, increased consistency is captured as increased correlation. So we're going to see an intersubject RDM, and it looks like this. So here, every cell in the RDM represents the correlation between a pair of subjects in terms of the representational formats at some specific point in time. Here, she's windowing them in this special time region that we've been focused on. And so she's ordered them, so you've got typical recognizers first and then super recognizers. What that means is the top left quadrant are basically reflecting controls correlated with controls. The bottom right is super recognizers correlated with super recognizers. You've got a kind of emergent yellow square there that hints that the degree of intersubject correlation you see depends on the actual group status of those individuals. We can test that by correlating that RDM with a theoretical model that basically says you should only be similar, representational formats should only be similar when you come from the same group and should not exist when you are not in the same group. We can ask how well that model predicts our intersubject RDMs. And what we find is a peak in that model's predictive power, also at that 350 millisecond time point, showing us that at that particular moment in time, the structure of identity representations is more consistent across individuals from the same group than individuals across different groups. You can split that up even more if you want to. Now here I'm just averaging this intersubject RDM. So I'm averaging the typical recognizers together, that's the top left quadrant, averaging the super recognizers in the lower right quadrant, and just plotting that sort of global metric of representational consistency as a function of time. Both groups have it. Both groups show consistency with one another. It rises sharply at 100 milliseconds. It continues to about 300. At that moment, the representational overlap between controls falls away, starts to fall away. But at that same moment, representational overlap between super recognizers, individual brains, is actually starting to climb. peaking again at that 350 millisecond time point. So what does all of this mean collectively? We think it means that super recognizers are not just separating these identities better in terms of the patterns in their neural signals at that 350 millisecond moment, but that face identity code is actually exhibiting a degree of shared structure across individuals that outpaces that we find in controls, which is novel and interesting for us to think about a bit more in terms of interpretation. Right, so I'm over time and we'll stop. I've shown you 3 experiments. We've been looking for implicit indices of identity perception and understanding how individual differences can modulate those. In experiment 1, we got our first evidence for this spontaneous prioritization of identity. In experiment 2, we tried to understand whether that is actually a mandatory kind of identity processing by making it task irrelevant. We think that both of those do suggest that spontaneous recognition is stronger in this group of individuals, but that prioritization of identity is not coming at a cost of encoding other face information. So they're still better at doing expression matching, even though they're more modulated by the identity information carried by the face. And then in experiment 3, we are exploring that neural basis, trying to see whether the face identity encode is enhanced for super recognizers relative to controls. And we find that it is at this post-perceptual stage. And moreover, we find that structure of that identity code itself is more consistent across super recognizers than it is across controls. And this is work that's obviously ongoing now. It's all being madly written up. Hopefully some progress is being made while I'm here. But for that reason, I'm really interested in your feedback and comments as we go. It's the right moment to sort of inject the work with those sorts of external perspectives. So I hope you've got some good ones for me. I'll just thank these people quickly. This is a subset of the team who's worked on producing this data. A lot of it has been Tim, your very own, who's done a lot of heavy lifting in the behavioural side, Martina on the EEG side, and with thanks to the team at Western and UNSW for supporting it. That's all.
All right, we have a bit of time for questions. Thanks for keeping that. Hopefully time ahead. Would anybody like to?
Thanks for sharing your amazing work. I have a question about your stimuli. In your experiment, you use human face with emotion. I was thinking if you use object, like an object figure without emotion, like kind of neutral, how is it going to affect the sensitivity of super recognized?
So I was just going to say, aren't you glad I cut experiment 4, but maybe you would have liked experiment 4. So we have also thought along those lines. We have Martina's second experiment that I'm not showing here is about exploring whether what we're finding here is a kind of domain general processing advantage that might be related to individuating exemplars coming from within a category. So she takes that framework that we saw for the faces, where you've got the 10 images of the 40 different people, and she's got that for dogs, for faces, for houses, for cars, and she's looking to see whether the effects that she finds are at all specific to faces or whether they're measurably demonstrated for other categories as well. That work's not quite finalized, but it does look more face specific than anything else. Interestingly, in that study, she added a memory element to it. So they do the EEG where they're blasted with all of these dogs and houses and faces and cars. And then after there's a surprise memory test. And we find that globally, the super recognizers are better on every category when it comes to memory, behaviorally, but that neurally, only the faces show that group-wise difference in terms of an encoding advantage, which is something that is a little bit hard to reconcile, but we need to grapple with it, right? Because maybe these measures are not tapping the same thing all the time.
Really fascinating work. I have so many questions, but I'll pick one. I was wondering what is the role of context in super recognizers? Because for some of us, if we go into a different context, we might not recognize that face. But I wonder if for super recognizers, it's context independent because they are so.
So we are, also thinking about exactly that topic. We have a PhD student who started halfway through last year, and her topic is context for faces and other sorts of objects for super recognizers. So she's running a study right now that is exactly kind of the classic face on a scene in terms of learning, and then it's either switched or the same when you pick it up again at test. So it's not this sort of implicit framework, but it's nevertheless kind of going up to that context idea. So far, everybody is sensitive to context. It's not immediately clear that super recognizers are immune. It does look like maybe there might be sort of some directional differences there in terms of facilitation versus interference, but it's a little bit too soon to say, I would think. But yeah, you can imagine that this would be like a good marker in a way, right? That the context doesn't matter to you because the face itself is so well represented.
Yeah, maybe it matters, but to a lesser degree.
Yes,
I look forward
exactly.
to that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in your last study, you had these, the faces identity had different like age, ethnicity, gender. Do you see any consistency in what they focus on? Or would this focus on different aspects, or in the terms of encoding, can you pick up what they might be encoding more than
We
others?
don't do, so it would be interesting to know whether there's like a kind of relative weighting. We did think a little bit along those lines for this study initially. I'll show you, I do have some of that data that I can share with you, where we kind of, instead of decoding identity, we relabel all the data by ethnicity, relabel by sex, etc. I can show you some of that. Gives you a sense of it. So this is decoding of face sex information. Everything else remains the same as what I described for the main analysis, but here it's just that we're looking at a different dimension of those same faces. It's not different recordings, it's obviously the same face encounter, but different kinds of signals carried in the neural response. This one is the surprising one, because here you sort of have this early dominance of sex information for the typical recognizers versus the controls, versus the super recognizers. This is maybe the only evidence we have of a kind of differential weighting of face dimensions across the two groups, separately from identity, of course. When it comes to ethnicity, the signal is super weak, so people are really not responding to this very strongly at all. It's probably because of the specific ethnicities that we used in our stimulus set. So we chose Caucasian faces and Hispanic faces. These obviously don't have the kind of contrast distinction that you would have if you would use, for example, East Asian faces or African American faces or what have you against a Caucasian face. That was a deliberate choice, I think, because I thought that would be difficult to control and separate from a low-level visual account. It's interesting to see that it's, at least in the case of ethnicity, the only group that might be coding that is super recognizers and not controls. Maybe that goes to the propensity to sort of hold more dimensions at once or consider more factors at once, if you're able to deal with identity in an efficient way. And this is age, which is comparable entirely across the two groups, and also a robust signal that's present in the data. Of course, you can reorder those plots so that you put the 4 dimensions on top of each other for controls and for super recognizers, and that kind of goes to a differential weighting account, but it's not as strong as we might have thought. I had thought maybe you would see like big shifts where everything is earlier for super recognizers or everything is stronger. It's not the case, it's more subtle.
If I may just follow up, kind of related question, but about ethnicity, because there's this idea that you have this average face and it's easier to recognize faces compared to what you've been exposed to. Do the super recognizers show the same effect, or are they better able to recognize faces across ethnicities that they might not even have?
That's interesting.
Been exposed
I
to?
don't think we ever split the data that way. So that would be basically enhanced identity decoding for the Caucasian faces relative to the Hispanic faces, based on our sample being mostly Caucasian.
Yes, or the reverse, or like maybe
Yes.
they don't care, like maybe they don't rely on this template and they can just
That's
a bit
interesting.
like if they're as good as with objects, they were
That's
saying maybe they're good at other things, that it doesn't actually matter too much whether they've been experienced to them or not.
Oh, well, of course, it could be two mechanisms that work there indeed. Yeah, that's interesting. I should think about that a little bit more. We never did that split. We did do, so it's also true that in the identity decoding, separating 40 identities, so separating Jen from Dan is a separation of identity, but it's also a sex separation as well, right? So there's a part of that signal that is accounted for by some of these other dimensions of the faces. So in our control analyses, we go to some effort to try and show that that don't account for the identity decoding that we have, but they are nevertheless contributing to that main analysis. And so your suggestion there about separating between the two different ethnicities we have in the stimulus sample, yeah, makes me think that we can maybe explore that a bit more in that same capacity.
So one question with two parts. I guess the framing about mandatory, I think, is interesting to me in the sense of, I think a lot of people would think who aren't super recognizers, super recognizers some extra ability. And it seems like the framing here is more of a failure of inhibition of identity, or a Midas touch almost, where identity, although it does help, you were saying it does help obviously, but it seems like, you have the open text responses, are people talking about it being an overwhelming burden to have this ability to consistently be remembering identities?
No, I don't think so. Maybe my phrasing there should be adjusted, because it's true that sort of, I guess, I've tried to stay away from the word automatic.
Yeah. The second point of that was just, if it's 350 milliseconds after, that sort of points also that it's not, how much are you thinking about it as being a learned thing, because it's not a structural thing that's happening very early, which would potentially mean that, not to say these people have learned to become focused on identity, but when you're developing a sense of which way we're paying attention to the world, if you sort of hook on to identity as a thing at some point, can you sort of untrain that in some people? Some of the super recognizers, how much of this is a consistent ability of a person that is a structural thing about a folding in particular areas that's promoting identity, rather than a generic, I guess, contexty learning thing?
Oof. I'm sorry, I've lost track of the question.
Just the idea of, is it a learning thing? Or is it more
I think you can't.
Mandatory thing.
Do you think it might be kids who are super recognized?
So yeah, people always want to know that, but I think often, I don't think people, it seems by all the report that I have from this group of people, that people don't necessarily know that they are something particular until they watch like Four Corners or whatever, and see a segment on it, and then their partner says like, oh, that's you, isn't it? And then, then they're on the website doing the test. So we had a meet and greet with some of the people in this registry earlier this year, and got a pretty good show up for that, which was nice, and people were motivated to come because it's kind of something they've just recently discovered about themselves. So I'm not sure that we would, I don't think I'd put a strong case on they've sort of trained themselves into it. I think there must be some initial sort of starting advantage that you have, but certainly people do go in that direction, and a lot of them are really motivated to find like jobs and things that are really exploiting that advantage. So I'm sure it's a mixture of both. There is some fMRI work going on at the moment in this space, but those results are not yet finalized. I do think that at the moment what they point to is that it isn't an early visual advantage in any capacity. It's probably something that's, certainly post-perceptual, potentially decisional in a kind of extended face network, which is kind of interesting to think about. I will say that it's not possible to train people to get to this level. So there's quite some work that David, our collaborator, has done on comparing people who are in these professional face comparative roles, like passport kinds of things, and whether or not the way they do face comparison or face matching is the same as what super recognizers do, and if they can get to the same level of performance. And the answer is no, they're not doing it the same, and no, they can't.
I was trying to think, like, could you stop the super recognizers? Could you put a sort of inhibition on them?
Yeah. I mean,
rather than bring the other ones up.
I'm quite interested in doing things along the lines of like trying to break the identity signal. So you could imagine like a morphing thing, or like a sort of non-disclosed morphing study where you sort of say, well, this is John, but then the sort of the John signal or whatever is being diluted as a function of time, and seeing, how resilient you are to sort of holding on to that representation versus letting it go. Because you could actually imagine that allowing more variation in Johnness would be an identity representational strength, but then presumably there's a hard cutoff where you should say, no, there is now not enough John to say that is reliably John. So there's maybe some interesting follow-up ideas in that space.
I'll leave my second part of the question to discussion.
Maybe that's a great segue to let's have maybe some further questions and discussion over food. Also, the meaning of super recognized sounds like the most high stakes social interaction I can think of, because everyone will just remember
It's unique
exactly
for
who
me.
you are. Yeah, but you won't remember any of them. So
So
yeah.
I'm just.
Yeah, but please join me again in thanking Jen for a fantastic talk, and yeah, please ask her all the rest of the questions.